The whole town told him the rock would kill him, and laughed when he moved in anyway. A retired veteran in a red and black flannel jacket walked away from his freezing wooden cabin and built into a limestone bluff, chasing warmth no one believed existed. With only his loyal German shepherd by his side, he faced the harshest winter the city had seen in decades. But when temperatures plunged below deadly levels and his neighbors' homes began to fail, something shocking happened inside that stone shelter. The rock held heat, lives were saved, and the man they called crazy became the only refuge left standing. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter fell over Butte, Montana, like an old curse remembered too well. The wind from the Rocky Mountains slicing through abandoned mining streets as temperatures sank past -40 and refused to rise. Frank Callahan stood outside his cabin before dawn, breath crystallizing in the air, snow crunching under worn boots that had marched across far harsher ground decades earlier. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped now, with a broad, angular face shaped by years of discipline and disappointment. His jaw was square, permanently shadowed by a graying beard he trimmed with military neatness out of habit rather than vanity. Deep lines cut from the corners of his eyes to his cheeks, not just from age but from squinting into desert sun and Arctic glare alike during his years in uniform. Over his layered wool shirt, Frank wore the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket he had owned since leaving the service. Its fabric faded at the elbows, the cuffs mended more than once. It was not fashionable, but it was familiar, and familiarity had become his last form of comfort. Frank lived alone on the outskirts of Butte, where old miners' shacks leaned into the hills like exhausted men who had never been allowed to rest. His cabin was small, rough-hewn, and built the way everyone else's had been built. Pine logs, mud chinking, a stone hearth in the corner. It had been enough once. He used to believe that. At his heels moved Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick gray-black coat and a broad chest that hinted at strength even in stillness. Shadow's ears, upomuras, were always alert, standing tall as if waiting for orders only he could hear. His amber eyes missed nothing, not the shifting wind, not the distant creak of frozen trees, not the subtle wrongness in the air that humans often ignored. Frank had found Shadow years earlier at a veterans shelter outside Helena, a quiet dog with scars on one flank and a distrust of sudden noise that mirrored Frank's own. They had bonded without ceremony, two survivors recognizing something unspoken in each other. That winter, something felt different. Frank noticed it first in the way the cabin sounded. Wood, when it was warm, made soft settling noises, a language of slow adjustments. Now it cracked sharply at night, snapping like bone under pressure. During the day, even with the stove roaring, the walls felt cold to the touch, as if the logs themselves were carrying the outside temperature inward. Frank woke each morning with stiffness in his joints that no amount of stretching could relieve, his breath fogging the air inside the cabin long after the fire had been lit. Shadow refused to sleep through the night. Instead, the dog paced near the door, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor, occasionally letting out a low, uneasy growl that was not directed at any visible threat. Frank understood that sound. It was the same sound men made in the trenches just before something went wrong. He tried to fix the cabin the way he had been taught. He stuffed new moss into the gaps between logs, reinforced the door with extra planks, burned through his firewood faster than he liked to admit. But the cold pressed in regardless, patient and relentless. One morning, Frank woke to find ice feathered along the inside wall near the window, delicate and deadly. He stood there for a long time, staring at it, feeling a quiet anger rise in his chest, not explosive rage, but the heavy, exhausted kind that came from realizing something trusted had failed. He had trusted structures his whole life, commands, systems, standard ways of doing things, and those structures had failed him before. The war had done that, slowly eroding his faith in rules that looked solid on paper but crumbled under real pressure. After the war, he had returned home quieter, more distant, the kind of man who answered questions politely but never volunteered information. Neighbors described him as reserved, even cold, though those who paid attention noticed he always helped shovel snow for elderly residents, without being asked, and never charged for repairs when someone's fence came down. In town, people like Tom Harris, a thick-necked former equipment operator, with a booming laugh and an easy confidence, liked to joke that Frank never really came back from overseas. Tom wasn't cruel, just careless, the way people often were when discomfort made them nervous. His wife, Sarah Harris, was different. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean with narrow shoulders, pale skin that flushed red quickly in the cold, and long brown hair usually braided down her back to keep it out of the wind. Sarah watched Frank with quiet concern whenever she saw him in town, her sharp gray eyes missing very little, though she never spoke more than a polite greeting. That winter, Frank stopped going into town as often. The cold made conversation feel unnecessary, and the cabin demanded constant attention. Yet even with the fire burning day and night, the warmth never lasted. Frank found himself sitting at the small table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, remembering nights from the war when concrete bunkers had felt warmer than this wooden box ever did. That thought disturbed him. It lingered. He began walking with Shadow beyond the usual paths, following old mining trails half buried in snow, places the town had forgotten. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the frozen hills in dull gold, Frank noticed how the air changed near a limestone outcrop left behind from Butte's mining days. The wind seemed quieter there, muted, as if the rock absorbed sound itself. He stepped closer, pressing a gloved hand against the stone. It was cold, but not biting, not alive with the same hostility as the wind. Shadow moved ahead, sniffing, tail lowering slightly, then sat near the rock and leaned his weight against it, something he rarely did. Frank watched him, heart beating a little faster. He remembered shelters carved into hillsides, remembered how stone held temperature, how earth did not panic when the weather turned violent. The idea unsettled him, not because it seemed dangerous, but because it seemed obvious in a way that made him question everything he had accepted without challenge. When Frank mentioned the rock to Tom Harris days later, casually, over supplies at the general store, Tom laughed loud enough to turn heads. He joked about cavemen and bears, about how Frank was finally giving in to the loneliness. Others chuckled. Frank smiled thinly, said nothing, and pulled his flannel jacket tighter around himself. He had learned long ago that explaining too early invited ridicule. Outside, Shadow waited, watching the town with calm indifference. That night, as the temperature plunged again and the fire struggled to keep up, Frank sat on his bed listening to the cabin creak and groan, Shadow pressed against his legs for warmth. He realized, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and relieving, that the cabin would not survive the winter without change, and neither, perhaps, would he. Somewhere beyond the laughter and the frozen streets, the rock waited, silent and patient, indifferent to opinion, ready to do what wood could not. Frank Callahan had survived jungles that breathed at night and shelters that shook under artillery. And what those years had taught him was simple. Tradition saved pride, not lives. He woke before dawn each day with the same thought pressing against his ribs like cold iron wood failed, because wood obeyed the weather, and weather never negotiated. He moved through his cabin with quiet purpose, packing only what mattered, tools worn smooth by years of use, a canvas roll of blankets, a small tin box of letters he never opened anymore. Outside, Shadow watched with unblinking focus, his thick gray-black coat rimed with frost, his breath steady. The dog sensed intention in Frank's movements, the same way soldiers sensed a change in orders before words were spoken. When Frank finally shouldered the last bundle and stepped into the snow, he did not look back. The cabin creaked behind him, an old animal protesting abandonment. But Frank had already let go. The limestone outcrop lay beyond the abandoned copper workings east of town, a place locals avoided not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded them of failure shafts that no longer paid, tunnels swallowed by darkness. Frank walked there with Shadow padding ahead, tail low, ears forward, leading not as a pet, but as a partner. The rock face rose from the hillside like a blunt promise, pale and layered, its surface scarred by time rather than rot. When Frank pressed his palm to it, he felt what he had hoped to feel: indifference to the wind, a steady cool that did not bite. He remembered nights in stone bunkers overseas when the cold screamed outside and never crossed the wall. That memory steadied him. He began at once. He marked lines with charcoal, measured with a length of twine, and set his tools to work. The sound of iron on limestone rang sharp and lonely across the frozen ground. Chips fell like pale snow. Each strike traveled up his arms into his shoulders, old injuries flaring. But he welcomed the pain. Pain meant progress. Shadow lay close to the rock, body curved against it, eyes half-lidded but alert. When the wind surged, the dog shifted closer, and Frank noticed that the gusts broke apart against the stone, losing their cruelty. Word spread quickly. By the third day, Tom Harris came by on his snowmobile, stopping at a distance with a grin that carried more disbelief than malice. Tom was broad-shouldered and heavy through the middle, his beard a sandy mess that never quite obeyed a comb, his laugh loud enough to fill a room. He shook his head, called it a fool's errand, asked if Frank planned to grow moss on the walls and call it home. Frank answered with a nod and kept working. Tom's grin faltered at the silence, then returned sharper. He left with a joke tossed over his shoulder, the kind meant to travel. Others followed. Some came out of curiosity, some out of pity, a few out of something closer to fear. Sarah Harris arrived once, standing apart from the others, hands tucked into her coat sleeves, posture straight despite the cold. She was tall and spare, her face narrow with high cheekbones, her skin pale and easily reddened by wind. Her long brown hair was braided tight down her back, practical and severe, and her eyes, cool gray, observant, tracked Frank's work rather than his face. She did not laugh. She asked quietly how he planned to keep moisture from rotting the wood. Frank paused long enough to answer. Space and air. He would keep the wood from touching the stone. Let the rock breathe. That night, Frank pitched a canvas lean-to against the rock and lit a small fire. The flame warmed the air quickly, but what caught his attention was the stone itself. After an hour, it no longer felt cold. It held the warmth like a patient animal, storing what it was given. He extinguished the fire and waited. The temperature dropped slowly, almost grudgingly. Shadow slept soundly for the first time in weeks, pressed against the limestone, paws twitching in dreams. Frank sat awake, counting minutes, listening to the wind fail. Over the next weeks, he worked with a rhythm born of stubborn clarity. He drilled anchor points by hand, iron chisel biting again and again into the limestone. The work was brutal and precise. His hands split and healed and split again. He set iron pins in mortar he mixed himself, testing the thickness until it cured without cracking. He raised a front wall of pine logs 6 inches from the stone, leaving a narrow channel of air between wood and rock. Each log fit tight to the pins, secure without touching the limestone. He built the right side wall to match, and where the stone curved inward, he let it remain exposed, a living surface rather than something to hide. Shadow stayed close, sometimes watching the trail, sometimes lying flat on his side with his back against the warmest part of the rock, tail thumping once when Frank spoke. The dog's scars showed clearly in the lamplight, now thin white lines across the flank and shoulder-old injuries that had healed crooked, reminders that survival left marks. People continued to talk. Children dared each other to approach the rock house. Men shook their heads in town. The pastor mentioned light and proper dwellings in a sermon without naming names. Frank heard all of it and let it pass. He had stopped measuring his life by the approval of others long ago, the day he learned that survival was often lonely. When the structure stood high enough to block the wind, Frank moved inside. He laid a stone hearth at the base of the rock, directly beneath a natural fissure he had discovered, a narrow crack that drew air upward like a chimney. He tested it with smoke and watched the draft pull clean and steady. He built a heavy door from planks and hung it true. The first night he slept fully inside, the temperature outside fell hard, the kind of drop that killed engines and courage alike. Inside, Frank lit a modest fire and waited. The warmth rose and settled, the stone drinking it in. He let the fire die and waited longer. The heat remained. He removed his flannel jacket, an act that felt almost ceremonial, and sat on his bed listening to the quiet. Shadow curled at his feet, sighing deeply, the sound of an animal that trusted the ground beneath it. Frank felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't known how to name. He was not triumphant. He was relieved. In the morning, frost coated the hills, and Butte lay silent under a white lid. Frank stepped outside and checked his thermometer, then stepped back in and checked it again. The difference was undeniable. He stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the stone, understanding that he had crossed a line. He would not go back. The town could keep its laughter. He had found something older and stronger than opinion, and winter had already begun to lose its grip. The cold reached its cruel peak without ceremony, a hard, sustained descent that pinned Butte beneath a lid of ice and silence. And on the night the thermometer outside dipped past -40, Frank Callahan noticed something unsettlingly calm inside his stone-backed shelter. He sat at the small table he had built himself, the grain of the pine smooth beneath his fingers, listening for the familiar complaints of a structure under stress. The popping of logs, the hiss of wind slipping through cracks, but there were none. The limestone behind him radiated a steady warmth that felt neither aggressive nor fragile, a deep, even heat that did not rise and flee the way fire did in his old cabin. Frank tested it methodically, the way he had learned to test equipment in the field. He let the fire burn low, then lower still, then go dark entirely, and he waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The temperature dropped only slightly, the air remaining comfortable enough that he removed his flannel jacket and hung it on a peg near the door, an act that felt almost defiant against the season itself. Shadow, sensing the change long before Frank trusted it, sprawled fully against the rock wall, his broad ribcage rising and falling in a slow, untroubled rhythm. The dog's ears, usually half-cocked even in rest, softened and folded back, his muzzle slack in a way Frank had never seen during winter. It struck Frank then that Shadow had not truly slept through the night in years, not since the shelter, not since the sirens and the shouting, and the nights when safety was always provisional. The stone seemed to grant him that sleep now, as if it recognized something wounded and offered quiet in return. Frank stood and pressed his palm flat against the limestone, feeling warmth sink into his skin. Not surface heat, but something stored and patient, and a realization settled into him with the same calm weight. The rock was not fighting the winter, it was ignoring it, refusing to acknowledge the cold as anything more than noise. Outside, the town fought back the only way it knew how. Smoke rose continuously from chimneys, thick and desperate, curling into a sky so cold it seemed to crack. People burned through wood at a pace that made them anxious, hauling sleds from farther and farther away as nearby stands were stripped bare. The sound of axes echoed constantly now, a rhythm of survival that never paused. Frank observed it from a distance, venturing into town only when necessary. He noticed frost creeping along the interior walls of shops, ice blooming behind window glass like pale flowers. He heard coughs that lingered too long, saw children wrapped in layers that still did not stop their shivering. In the general store, a man named Leonard Pike, thin as a rail, with a sharp nose reddened raw by the cold, and hands that trembled even near the stove, complained loudly about drafts and failing chinking. His voice edged with fear he tried to mask with irritation. Leonard was a bookkeeper by trade, unused to physical hardship, his posture always slightly hunched as if protecting his chest from blows that never came. And Frank noticed how he stood closer to the heat than anyone else, eyes flicking toward the door each time it opened. When someone mentioned Frank's rock house, laughter followed, brittle and forced. The joke had grown tired, repeated too often without delivering relief. Sarah Harris came by the stone shelter one afternoon under the pretense of returning a borrowed lantern. She stood at the threshold for a moment before stepping inside, her expression carefully neutral. Up close, the cold had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes, but her gaze remained steady, practical. She took in the space quickly, the gap between wall and stone, the way the fire sat against the limestone, the absence of frost. "It's warm," she said finally, not as praise but as an observation. Frank nodded. She reached out and touched the rock with bare fingers, then withdrew her hand slowly, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. "Tom says it's luck," she added. Frank met her eyes. "Luck doesn't repeat itself this consistently," he replied. Sarah did not argue. She left soon after, but when she did, she pulled her coat tighter and walked back toward town with a slower, more deliberate pace, as if recalculating something she had taken for granted. Days passed. The cold did not ease. The laughter thinned further, replaced by an unease that traveled quietly, without announcements. Frank noticed it in small ways. Fewer jokes shouted across the street, more glances toward the hills where his shelter stood. A subtle shift in how people spoke his name. Shadow sensed it too. When Frank opened the door in the mornings, The dog no longer bristled at distant sounds. Instead, he sat and watched the town, head tilted slightly, as if waiting for a signal. One night, near the end of January, the wind rose sharply, shrieking across the open ground with renewed violence. Frank woke to the sound of it hammering the door, not threatening, but insistent. He checked the thermometer out of habit. Inside, 19 degrees Celsius. Outside, a number so low it barely registered meaning. He banked the fire lightly and returned to bed. Hours later, Shadow lifted his head and growled, not the warning growl of before, but something different, alert and focused. There was movement outside. Footsteps, uneven and slow. Frank rose, pulling on his flannel jacket, and opened the door. The wind rushed past him, but behind it stood Leonard Pike, his thin frame bent forward, face pale beneath a crust of frost. Leonard's beard, usually neat and narrow, was stiff with ice, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. He tried to speak and failed, his lips trembling. Frank ushered him inside without a word. Leonard staggered, then sank onto a bench, hands shaking violently as warmth wrapped around him. He stared at the stone walls as if they were an illusion that might vanish. "My stove cracked," he managed finally, voice hoarse. "The fire wouldn't hold. I didn't know where else." Frank handed him a mug of broth and waited. Leonard drank greedily, color slowly returning to his cheeks. He did not apologize. He did not joke. He simply sat, breathing, eyes fixed on the rock, as if committing it to memory. By morning, Leonard was steady enough to leave. He thanked Frank with a quiet intensity that made words unnecessary and promised to return the favor when he could. When Frank watched him walk away, shoulders hunched against the cold, he understood that something had shifted irrevocably. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with reconsideration. Over the next week, the stone shelter became a reference point even when it was not spoken of directly. People measured their own cold against rumors of Frank's warmth. Children stopped daring each other to approach the rock house. They had learned from their parents' tension that it was no longer a joke. The town's noise dimmed, replaced by a focused, brittle quiet born of endurance rather than mockery. Frank noticed the change most clearly at night, when the wind screamed and the shelter remained unmoved. He lay awake beside Shadow, listening to the deep stillness of the stone, aware that winter was pressing harder than ever against the town, and that the laughter which once protected people from fear had finally fallen away, leaving only the truth to face. He did not feel vindicated. He felt prepared, and in that strange, steady warmth, he waited for what would come next. The knock came late, near the hour when even the wind seemed to hesitate, and Shadow was on his feet before the sound fully reached Frank's waking mind, the German shepherd's deep bark exploding toward the door with a force that cut through the storm. Frank rose instantly, body moving with the reflexes of a man who had slept through danger once too often to ever do it again. He pulled on his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the heavy fabric warm against his shoulders, and crossed the small room in 3 measured steps. Outside, the wind screamed like an animal caught in steel, snow whipping sideways, visibility reduced to little more than shadows. Another knock followed, weaker this time, followed by a hoarse voice calling Frank's name. When Frank opened the door, warmth surged outward into the night like breath from a living thing. Tom Harris stood there bent almost double, his broad frame reduced by exhaustion, his thick beard crusted with ice. He was clutching his wife Sarah with one arm and gripping the sleeve of his son Jacob with the other, the boy half dragged, half carried through knee-deep snow. Tom's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a tight, desperate focus, the look of a man who had reached the end of stubbornness. Sarah Harris looked smaller than Frank remembered, her tall, lean figure folded inward, shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Her pale skin had gone waxy, lips tinged blue, and her long brown hair had slipped loose from its braid, strands frozen stiff against her coat collar. Her gray eyes were unfocused, blinking slowly, each movement costing effort. Jacob, 10 years old and thin for his age, had the narrow face of a child who spent too much time indoors, dark hair plastered to his forehead, with sweat that froze as quickly as it formed. His hands were bare, fingers white and rigid, his breath shallow and uneven. Frank did not ask questions. He stepped aside and waved them in, already moving to clear space. Shadow backed away from the door without instruction, positioning himself near the hearth, ears high, eyes locked on the newcomers, alert, but not aggressive. As soon as the door closed, the contrast hit them. The air inside the stone-backed shelter was steady and warm, not the harsh heat of a roaring fire, but something deeper, enveloping, a warmth that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah sagged, knees buckling, and Frank caught her before she fell, guiding her to the bench near the limestone wall. Tom tried to speak, tried to explain, but his words tangled and died. Frank cut him off with a firm nod and a hand on his shoulder, a silent command to sit. He wrapped Sarah in blankets, tucking them around her with practiced efficiency, then knelt to examine Jacob's hands and feet. The boy whimpered softly when Frank touched him, pain flaring as sensation began to return. Frank spoke quietly, voice low and steady, telling him to breathe slowly, to stay still. He ladled broth from a pot that always simmered lightly in winter, pressing the warm mug into Tom's shaking hands first, then guiding it to Sarah's lips. Shadow approached cautiously, lowering his head so his warm breath brushed Jacob's numbing fingers, the dog's body radiating heat of its own. The minutes stretched. Color crept back into Sarah's cheeks. Her shivering softened, then slowed. Jacob's breathing evened, his fingers twitching as blood returned, pain replacing numbness, a good sign. Tom sat hunched forward, elbows on knees, staring at the stone wall as if it might vanish if he looked away. His face, usually ruddy from wind and laughter, was gray and drawn, the lines around his mouth deeper than Frank remembered. "The stove cracked," Tom finally said, voice rough. "The fire wouldn't hold. I kept feeding it, but the cold just—" He swallowed hard. "I waited too long." Frank listened without judgment. He had waited too long once, too, in other ways. He nodded once and rose to tend the fire, adding a single log, not for heat so much as comfort. The limestone behind the hearth absorbed it without complaint, already warm, already prepared. Sarah slept, her breathing deepening into a rhythm that spoke of recovery. Jacob leaned against Shadow's side, eyes half closed, small fingers curled into the dog's thick fur. The night raged on outside, but inside, time slowed. Word traveled faster than the storm. By morning, the wind still howled, but the sky had lightened to a hard, pale gray. Tom rose stiffly, pride and gratitude warring in his posture. He tried to speak again, to apologize perhaps, but Frank stopped him with a small shake of the head. "Get warm," he said simply. "That's enough." Tom nodded, eyes wet, and went to check on Sarah and Jacob, who were already awake, color returned, fear receding. They left late that morning when the wind eased enough to make the walk survivable, Tom promising to return, his voice carrying a humility Frank had never heard before. He did return, sooner than expected, but not alone. The knock came again the following evening, then again the next day. Sometimes it was a single person, sometimes a family bundled together, faces tight with cold and shame. Frank did not turn anyone away, though he kept order with quiet authority. Children came first, then the elderly, then those whose fuel had run out completely. One of the first was Mrs. Eleanor Fitch, an 82-year-old widow with a stooped back and skin like parchment, her white hair pulled into a thin bun beneath a wool cap. She spoke little, her voice brittle with age, but when she sat near the limestone wall, her hands stopped shaking, and she closed her eyes with a long sigh that sounded like release. Another was Clara Benson, a freckled 8-year-old with bright red hair and a stubborn chin, her toes pale and swollen with early frostbite. Frank guided her to sit near Shadow, who accepted the responsibility solemnly, allowing the child to rest her cold feet against his flank. Clara laughed weakly when sensation returned, tears following, pain and relief mixing together. Frank watched it all with a steady calm that masked the weight pressing behind his ribs. The shelter was small. He rotated people through, set hours, managed supplies carefully. The limestone did most of the work, holding warmth through long stretches without fire. But Frank maintained routines with military precision. Shadow adapted quickly to his new role, stationing himself near the door, alert to approaching footsteps, posture protective but gentle with those who entered. The dog's growl returned only when the wind surged violently, as if the cold itself were an enemy to be challenged. By the end of the week, the laughter that had once followed Frank through town was gone entirely. In its place was something quieter and heavier: acknowledgement. People did not speak it aloud, but they carried it in the way they looked at the stone-backed shelter, in the careful respect with which they knocked, in the way they lowered their voices inside, as if the walls deserved it. Frank slept less during those days, but he slept without fear. Each knock that came brought urgency, but also purpose. He was no longer waiting for winter to break him. He was standing in its path, not defiant, not triumphant, simply present. On the 7th night after Tom's arrival, as Frank banked the fire and checked the room one last time, he realized the truth he had been circling since the first knock. This place was no longer just a shelter. It had become a threshold, the point where stubborn pride ended and survival began. And winter, relentless as it was, had finally met something it could not easily take. Spring did not arrive in Butte with celebration. It crept in slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself was unsure it was safe to thaw. Snow withdrew in uneven patches, revealing warped porches, split logs, and chimneys blackened by months of desperate burning. The town smelled of wet ash and exhaustion. Frank Callahan watched the change from the mouth of his stone-backed shelter, his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket hanging looser on his frame than it had in autumn, his beard longer now, streaked more heavily with white. Shadow stood beside him, older in posture if not in years, his thick gray-black coat shedding clumps of winter fur that clung to the limestone like memories refusing to let go. The shelter behind them looked almost unchanged, the rock as solid and indifferent as it had been in January, the wood dry and intact. In town, repair began immediately. Men patched walls, replaced chinking, salvaged what furniture had survived being burned. No one spoke loudly about winter anymore. Conversations were shorter, more deliberate, weighted with what had nearly been lost. No one apologized to Frank. Frontier pride did not bend that way. But something else happened, quieter and more meaningful. People began to ask questions. It started with Samuel Reed, a carpenter in his early 50s, whose hands were thick with scars and whose left thumb bent oddly from an old saw accident. Samuel was a careful man by nature, methodical, not given to mockery even when others laughed. He came one morning with a notebook tucked under his arm, eyes squinting against the pale light. He walked the perimeter of Frank's shelter without speaking, tracing the air gap between wood and stone with his gaze, studying how the roof met the limestone without trapping water. "How far back does the rock hold heat?" he asked finally, voice rough but respectful. Frank answered plainly. Others followed. Tom Harris returned often, not as a man seeking refuge now, but as one seeking understanding. He looked different, too. Leaner, quieter, his booming laugh replaced by a habit of listening first. His beard was trimmed shorter, his movements less careless. Sarah Harris accompanied him sometimes, her posture still straight, her gray eyes sharper than ever. She asked practical questions about moisture, about children sleeping near stone, about summer heat. Her hands, once always tucked into sleeves against the cold, moved freely now, confident. She had seen enough to trust evidence over opinion. Leonard Pike came by with careful steps, bringing supplies he insisted Frank accept: dried beans, flour, a length of good canvas. Leonard's thin face had filled out slightly since winter ended, though the anxiety in his eyes never fully left. "I'd like to build something similar," he said one afternoon, voice hesitant. "Not exactly the same, just smarter." Frank nodded. He never claimed ownership over the idea. He explained principles instead of plans, spoke of stone as mass, of air as ally, of listening before building. He never lectured. That was the key. By the following winter, the hills around Butte had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to notice. A small shelter appeared near the old quarry, its back wall embedded into rock. Another rose near the eastern ridge, half hidden, its roof sloping gently into stone. People called them bluff houses at first, then simply warm houses. No one laughed. Shadow grew older with the seasons, his muzzle silvered further, his movements slower but more deliberate. He still slept pressed against limestone when winter returned, eyes closing fully, trusting the ground beneath him. Children visited often now, some of the same ones who had once dared each other to run up to the crazy rock house. They brought scraps for Shadow, who accepted them with grave dignity, tail wagging only once or twice. Frank remained unchanged in the ways that mattered. He did not seek credit. He did not move back into town. He repaired tools for neighbors, helped set anchor pins when asked, showed young men how to test stone before trusting it. When praised, he deflected with a shrug. "The rock did the work," he said. "I just stopped arguing with it." Years passed. The winters remained harsh, Montana did not soften, but fewer people feared them. Fuel lasted longer. Children slept warmer. The town learned, slowly, unevenly, the lesson Frank had learned alone. Survival was not about domination. It was about alignment. One late winter evening, long after the shelter had become ordinary, Frank sat beside the hearth, Shadow's head heavy on his boot, the limestone warm at his back. Outside, snow fell steadily, silent and unthreatening. Frank ran a hand over the rock, feeling the stored heat, the patience of it, and thought of all the years he had spent fighting conditions that could not be beaten. He had survived war by following orders. He had survived winter by unlearning them. When spring came again, as it always did, the shelter stood ready, unchanged, waiting, and the town, wiser now, listened. In the end, this story was never just about stone, winter, or survival. It was about a quiet, miracle one that doesn't arrive with thunder or fire, but with patience, humility, and listening. Sometimes God does not remove the storm. Sometimes He teaches us where to stand so the storm cannot break us. The rock Frank trusted was not a replacement for faith. It was a reminder of it. Scripture tells us that a wise man builds his house upon the rock, not because the storms won't come, but because the foundation will hold when they do. In our own lives, we all face winter's seasons of fear, loss, exhaustion, or loneliness, or we keep building the same ways we were taught, even when they no longer protect us, and we wonder why we feel cold inside. Maybe the lesson is not to fight harder, but to listen more closely, to slow down, to notice the quiet guidance God places in our path, sometimes through pain, sometimes through unexpected ideas, sometimes through help we once laughed at. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder. You are not forgotten in your hardest season. There is strength beneath your feet, even when you can't see it yet. Trust that God is still working, often in silence, often through ordinary things, often through lessons that only make sense after the storm has passed. If you found meaning here, please share this story with someone who might need warmth today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what season of life you're walking through right now. We read every message, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of faith, resilience, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm body and soul through every winter you face.